Okay, so these bi-weekly episodes are going to be a bit longer than others because I have some singles and trailers that I want to discuss, and hopefully I don't lose the footage this time. Also, timestamps in the description of this video so you can jump around to everything that I talk about nice and easily. Also, last week's episode is up on my blog in text form, so if you want to check that out, that'll be in the description as well. As for this week, it was a mixed bag at best, probably putting it very lightly there. Let's start off with a movie that I missed last week. It's called COVID-21 Lethal Virus, directed by Daniel H. Torrado. It stars Christian Stam and Lee Partridge. It was released on the 3rd of January and it is available on digital services. So I'm not usually one to make a habit of going out of my way to look for bad movies to watch. Usually just the bad movies that I just so happen to stumble upon during a year are enough to satiate my thirst for bad movies to make fun of. But when it's January and I'm bored and we're still weathering the global pandemic, I'm in a situation where I have to take what I can get and just cross my fingers. But even with that in mind, I don't think I've ever stooped to a level quite this low before. I also don't think I've ever come to a judgment on what a movie's quality is likely to be by looking at the title alone quite as much as I did do with this movie. COVID-21 Lethal Virus. It doesn't exactly have quality written all over it. At best, it was likely to be in bad taste, and at worst, it was probably going to be a miserable experience. But once in a while, you do stumble upon movies that are so bafflingly incompetent that they come back around into being kind of entertaining. Or perhaps a movie that's so ruthlessly corporate that it at least raises some interesting conversation about the money-hungry pig that is the film industry. Unfortunately, much to my disappointment, COVID-21 Lethal Virus falls into neither of these categories, and it's just terrible, plain and simple. To keep this brief, I'm just going to rattle through a bunch of notes that I took during the movie and just leave it at that. The acting is consistently poor, lacking the urgency that you would expect for a zombie movie. The direction is sluggish, certain scenes go on painfully long. The editing is inconsistent and jittery, treating any kind of sense of continuity as an afterthought. The score is particularly atrocious and pompous in the extreme. The cinematography is flat out awful, and the overuse of handheld camera techniques is vomit-inducing, even outside of the action scenes. The abuse of horrible, flashy, strobe-like lighting effects makes my head spin. The screenplay is both overstuffed and underdeveloped. Like, at the start, it seemed like it was trying to comment on the pandemic, but the next minute it's commenting on climate change, the next it's commenting on social media, and the movie is a thematic clusterfuck as a result. The characters are universally terrible. They're all anonymous, disposable, and I don't care about them. Any attempt at any kind of emotional arc feels frail because the movie is so soullessly assembled. And worst of all, the movie feels like a dumb lie. It's a stupid zombie movie packaged as if it's related to the pandemic in an attempt to gaslight audiences into buying it, when the link is tenuous at best. And I don't want to hear the budgetary restraints argument on this one. After all, Sean Baker's movie Tangerine was shot on 3 iPhone 5Ss. That's proof enough that the budgetary restraints argument is nonsense. Talent, or in this case a lack thereof, will always shine through regardless of budgetary restraints. If I'm going to give this movie any shred of credit at all, it would be to highlight that whoever was handling the cinematography does at least have some idea of how to compose a decent wide establishing shot, to the extent that the first few minutes of the movie had me thinking that it might not be that bad, but boy, I was wrong. It's getting a 1 out of 10 if that wasn't obvious. And unfortunately, we're staying with the utter crap. Stuck Apart was directed by Darul and Gagmar Taylan, stars Engin Günyardin, Haluk Beligna, and Bina Kaya, and was released on January the 8th on Netflix. This was unquestionably one of the more tedious movies I've sat through as of late. Set in the throes of a midlife crisis, Aziz is facing relationship troubles, family troubles, work-related troubles, basically troubles with everything, and when it's revealed he's lost a necklace that his girlfriend gave to him, his life appears to turn into a downward spiral as he tries to get it back. The movie then goes in a half dozen different directions with hardly any connective tissue, switching perspectives and abandoning character arcs like they don't even matter. And that is probably the biggest problem with Stuck Apart. It doesn't do anything to elevate its characters to make me care about them. They are so one-dimensional to an extent that it's kind of a chore to become emotionally attached to them. You might say that, well, because this is a comedy, the characters not being interesting doesn't even necessarily really matter, as long as the movie has some kind of flair and distinct character to it on its own. But that raises the question of what on earth the movie is actually supposed to be, and I'm not entirely sure I have a clear answer of that at all. In the few moments where it does feel like it's going for more comedy, it feels painfully forced and awkward. And when it's trying to cultivate that lonely and tragic edge, it ends up burying its head so firmly in the misery of everything that's going on that the contrast is whiplash-inducing. A contrast that certainly isn't helped by ending a movie partly about suicide and trauma in the dumbest and most ridiculous way possible. Now, all of this could potentially be excusable if the movie had something of a unique heart to it, as I kind of said before. But yeah, I can't even say that that's true here. If anything, there's a very distinct smugness that this movie seems to ooze. It's like the writers think they've made a Charlie Kaufman-esque masterpiece when they very much have not. Because say what you want about Charlie Kaufman, his movies certainly are meandering and dreary, but they're at least focused and feel like they have some kind of distinct vision. Stuck Apart, meanwhile, treats its characters as more disposable enigmas rather than people, uses comedy as a means to undercut drama and tension rather than give the movie any sort of charm. And for a movie that runs only a smudge over 90 minutes, there are remarkably many scenes that run painfully long again. Also, in case I haven't mentioned this already, it's incredibly boring. It's kind of slow, dull drudgery that I'd be begging to do anything else but watch it. And I get that some of this is going to be a generational thing, whatever, I get it. This is a middle-aged story, clearly aimed at a middle-aged audience. I get that. But if I learned anything last year, it's that whether or not I'm in the target demographic for a movie doesn't really have any impact on whether I'm likely to enjoy a film. My favourite movies of last year certainly weren't aimed at me, so that excuse doesn't really fly with me, to be honest. I will say that there are some cool editing flourishes during some of the dramatic beats, and the cinematography does at least have something of a commanding, stately quality to it. It does show a baseline of technical competence, if nothing else. It's certainly not offensively bad, but it is a terrible movie that I will not be recommending to anyone. It gets a 3 out of 10, it does not deserve your time. Wow, so this week has been kind of terrible so far, but luckily I have a counterpoint to all of that. Pieces of a Woman was directed by Cornel Mundruczó, stars Vanessa Kirby, Shia LaBeouf, and Ellen Bernstein, and was released on the 7th of January on Netflix. This was one of my most anticipated movies of the year, and we're getting it right at the start, and it is indeed amazing. In fact, it's so good, I'm going to try and avoid talking about plot altogether if I can, other than just in broad abstraction, as you kind of have to, in case anyone hasn't seen it. It really is worth going into this movie as blind as you can, but I'll say this much. This is a movie about trauma, and more importantly, how someone might go about recovering having gone through some traumatic event in the past. The movie even goes so far as to ask the harrowing question of whether or not it's even possible to fully recover from trauma of the magnitude that you see play out in scary detail in this movie. It's a movie about trying to pick up the pieces, hence the title, of your life and focus on moving forward in the face of grief, even as everyone around you seeks to pull you back into it. And if you're a woman that suffered the trauma that Martha has in this movie, those pieces can be awfully fragile indeed. After all, it's the person at the center of the grief that really feels the grunt of it and has to carry that emotional weight, even while everyone on the peripheries of the grief likes to pretend that they get it just as much when they clearly don't. They're just projecting their ideas and beliefs onto the situation without properly understanding anything. And the movie dares you to judge them for doing so, which of course you can't do because we're all guilty of projecting our own emotions and feelings onto other people's situations from time to time. Everyone's human at the end of the day. But of course there's another side to this coin, and it comes through in Martha's relationship with Shia LaBeouf's character Sean. Because on the one hand you have Martha, who's dealing with the situation more quietly and internally in an attempt to not let her trauma come to define her. And on the other hand, you have Sean, who's more outward and borderline aggressive in the way he's coping, retreating into all old habits in a desperate attempt to find some kind of escapism. And putting those two characters in a relationship with one another, it makes for a naturally interesting dynamic. And then something shifts. The movie becomes about accountability and the threshold between what you can forgive and forget, and when someone actually needs to pay for their actions. Sometimes it's just more fulfilling to move on than it is to go out looking for revenge. Even if you end up winning that court case at the end of it, what have you actually gained? Do you want to put that additional emotional pressure on yourself to win the case? Do you want to make that person's life a living hell even if they are responsible for your trauma? Do you want to give in to social convention and point fingers even though you have no obligation to? Yeah, so just like everything in life, it's much easier to ask these questions than it is to actually confront them. But even with that in mind, the answer seems obvious. It should be up to her. It should be up to Martha. In a lot of ways, the movie is about Martha reclaiming her independence, understanding that there is a better way around the problem, and coming out better because of it. It's a movie that understands that empathy doesn't cost anything, and sometimes forgiving, moving on, and not being needlessly accusatory is the most fulfilling thing you can do, even if it hurts. Or at least that's the arc that Martha follows throughout the movie. Sean's a little different. I've already mentioned how his outward approach to dealing with the grief runs in total contrast to Martha, but the pair of them begin to develop contrasting ideas on what needs to happen moving forward, and things get pretty intense from there. Sean tries to insist to Martha that those who are responsible must pay for their actions, but does he actually believe that, or is he just feeling the social pressure to be the man in the situation and put people to justice? And those societal pressures and social conventions are an omnipresence in the movie rather than spelled downright in the text. Writer Kata Weber puts an awful lot of faith in her audience to pick up the layers of subtext that lurk just beneath the movie's murky surface. And I wouldn't have it any other way. In fact, this is the kind of movie that could easily come across as too devastating to ever want to revisit again. But when the movie is as hypnotically presented as this one is, I find it hard to make that criticism. For one, the acting is downright breathtaking. Both Vanessa Kirby and Shia LaBeouf give award-worthy performances, but Ellen Bernstein might have a Best Supporting Actress nomination in the bag at this year's Oscars, as she probably gives the most ravishing performance here. And it's a good thing that the acting is as strong as it is across the board, because the editing often resorts to glorious long takes that demand the actors be pulling their weight in order to keep them engaging, which of course they always are. In more ways than one, Pieces of a Woman reminds me of another Netflix movie, Noah Baumbach's Marriage Story. But while that movie showed two sides in fierce rivalry with one another, Pieces of a Woman shows a situation in absolute tatters from all sides, where a little bit of empathy might go a long way despite Martha being the only one who seems to understand that. It's the kind of movie that's so good that I'm clutching at straws trying to find things to criticize about it. I will say that the movie hits more in isolated emotional beats, and at over 2 hours it doesn't quite manage to sustain that emotionality across the bulk of its runtime outside of those isolated beats. Or simply put, the movie doesn't quite live up to what the first 30 minutes of this film promise. And as a result, I'll make the exact same observation that I made about Aaron Sorkin's Trial of the Chicago 7 in my Best of 2020 video. And that's that it can be quite hard to shake off the feeling that the movie serves as Oscar bait and little else. After all, there isn't much of a moral to this story beyond the world is brutally unforgiving and we need to stand up and face it, and it leads to a movie that feels unsteady, as if it's ready, perhaps almost preparing to collapse in on itself at any time and it's just waiting for the right moment to do so. I'm also not entirely sure it has a great ending, a little too comfortable and calculated for its own good, perhaps. But that should not take away the fact that you should absolutely see this movie if you have access to Netflix. 2021 is finally off the mark when it comes to great movies, and I thoroughly believe this is one that people are going to be talking about for years and decades to come. 9 out of 10, this is 2021's movie to beat so far. So now that's done, let's turn our attention to some upcoming movies and go through 4 trailers that released during that week. First one to go through is Bliss, directed by Mike Cahill. It stars Salma Hayek, Madeline Zimmer, and Owen Wilson. It will be released on the 5th of February 2021 and will be available on Amazon Prime Video. It is kind of a little weird, I think, that Amazon Prime Video, of all services, is responsible for distributing 3 movies that landed on my Best of 2020 list. I don't know, I guess someone working at Amazon must have decent taste. Unfortunately, I've not got a lot to comment on this latest one from them, but it does look thematically interesting at least. I've always liked stories that deal with the idea of the line between reality and fantasy, or in this case reality and simulated reality, becoming so blurred to the point of indistinguishability, and the characters having to learn to cope with that. I like that as a concept. But the trailer does have a disposable, thrown together feel to it, so I don't have a lot of hope that this is going to be good, but it's got the right idea, it seems. It's got a good idea, at least at its core, it seems. I might check it out anyway, we'll see. Next up, Malcolm and Marie, directed by Sam Levinson, and it stars John David Washington and Zendaya in the respective title roles. And it will be released on the 5th of February on Netflix. Now, there is actually some controversy attached to this one, so you're gonna have to bear with me. This is a romance film where John David Washington and Zendaya are a couple, and there was some backlash because of the 12-year age gap between the two leads. It seems like the kind of pairing that's almost designed to generate controversy, and, well, in my opinion, if the chemistry between the two is strong, the 12-year age gap shouldn't even be relevant to the discussion. And wow, not only does it look like by this trailer that this is totally the case, but Netflix might have another huge hit on their hands. Earlier this month, a critics-only screening was held, and it received considerable acclaim from social media from the critics who saw it, pretty much across the board as far as I can tell, so that bodes well. And considering the performances were at the kind of core of that acclaim, I don't think we have anything to worry about in that department, at least. Also, it's in black and white and it looks totally artsy, so absolutely my thing. My expectations have stepped up considerably, and I'm looking forward to covering this when it drops on Netflix next month. Okay, so next up, rattling through these at least fairly quickly, To All the Boys, Always and Forever, Lara Jean, directed by Michael Fimugnari, starring Lana Condor, Noah Centineo, and Madeline Arthur. This will be released on the 12th of February on Netflix. So I've actually done my homework with this one, as this is the third installment of a series where I've actually seen the first two. And the first is far better than the second, I'll tell you that. Yeah, the whole fake dating thing is kind of boring and played out, but when it's infused with enough charm, a strong, cutesy lead performance from Lana Condor, and a narrative where the stakes actually feel relatively high, it ended up elevating it for me. In contrast, the sequel that came out last year was a bit of a letdown, simply because it was far less dramatic. The first one just felt like it had more stakes. You know, the plot was better. The oh my god, all my love letters are out in the world plot just has way more stakes to it for me than the generic love triangle nonsense that the second installment tries to pull. Unfortunately, this new trailer doesn't do anything to convince me that this isn't going to be painfully generic, just like the second one. The big twist of this trailer, I guess, is that Lara Jean has not made it into Harvard, meaning that she may well end up separated from her boyfriend Peter. And oh my goodness, why should I care? That is the main question I'm asking here, and the trailer doesn't seem able to dish up a decent answer, especially as the movie seems content with pretending that the second one never even happened. I mean, is John Ambrose even going to be in this movie? Come on, I liked him. Anyway, I will cover this when it comes out, more out of obligation than anything else, just to see if the series goes out with a bang or a whimper. Probably the latter, but we'll have to see. Also, if anyone's wondering, no, I haven't read the books. Moving on. Last film is Cherry, directed by the Russo brothers. It stars Tom Holland, Chiara Bravo, Jack Reynor is in this, and Forrest Goodluck as well. It will release on the 12th of March on Apple TV+. Tom Holland proved to me in 2020 that he was a more diverse performer than at least I thought he was, in his performance, particularly in Antonio Campos' The Devil All the Time. And Cherry looks to be another attempt to silence the doubters. But the trailer isn't exactly selling the movie to me all that well, mainly because the trailer feels like it's having a bit of an identity crisis halfway through as it tries to juggle the intense action scenes with the romance element. I hope the movie isn't as clumsy and generic as the trailer makes it look like. Tom Holland's character seems to be juggling his bank robbing with spending time with his girlfriend, and somewhere along the line enrolls in the army. I mean, there's a lot going on here, it seems. It seems like there's going to be plenty of narrative strands. I just hope that they all connect into a cohesive movie. I'll be seeing this for Tom Holland alone, probably, but I'm certainly hesitant. Great, so that's the movie segment of the show done. Now let's move on to albums, and I've got two to talk about here. First one I want to discuss is Passenger's latest one. It came out on the 8th of January. It's called Songs for the Drunk and Brokenhearted. It's hard to not like Passenger. And when I say that, I'm more talking about the image rather than the music. I mean, 100% of the profits of this album are going to charities that are working in developing countries restoring areas destroyed by deforestation. You've got to respect that. Unfortunately, his albums have got progressively less interesting as the years have crept on, and especially his songwriting more indistinct. The last album I heard from him was 2018's Runaway, a solid return to form, but this is a backslide, unfortunately, in every conceivable way compared to that album. The writing is painting in as broad strokes as ever. The galloping groove that characterized albums like Runaway has pretty much disappeared, and the album is a lot sparser overall, which only draws attention towards Passenger's vocals, and they are an acquired taste at best, especially his upper register that he tries on Sword from the Stone. But the biggest issue here is that the writing is just nowhere near as interesting as it needs to be. The Way That I Love You probably could have been a tolerable love song, but it ends up one of the more detestable here, probably the only real dud, as Passenger has to go and frame himself as the knight in shining armor who's going to save this girl when the world inevitably becomes too much for her. which is kind of disgusting. Then there's the One Night Stand to Escape from Reality on Remember to Forget, and Suzanne, which might be a decent song, but it just feels like a lesser version of David from Whispers, with less lyrical detail across the board. I will say that I do really like the reunion with an old ex on Sword from the Stone, where he's seeing them move on and he's still trying to pull whatever he's got of his life together. It's a sweet bit of emotional vulnerability from him. I wish the rest of the album felt as personal as that song does. And as for the production, well, I was initially willing to give this album the benefit of the doubt because I figured that the recording process was probably going to be compromised because of COVID. But it turns out that the recording of this album, it dates back to 2019, so that shouldn't really be a huge problem at all. And look, it's certainly not bad, and you do get songs like Tip of My Tongue and What You're Waiting For that prove the jangly texture that characterized Runaways hasn't gone away entirely, at least. Even as the main melody that is pretty strong on that latter song just ends up getting suffocated in the mix. But it's on the songs where all that texture is stripped away that prove Passenger's writing just isn't enough to carry these songs on their own. It's an okay album, but it does just get tiresome in a hurry. I don't think Passenger will ever top his 2007 album Wicked Man's Rest, back when Passenger was still a band, for sheer walloping power, but he's got closer than this. 6 out of 10, you're not really missing that much if you skip it. Okay, next up, let's quickly talk about Morgan Wallen's latest one. It's called Dangerous, the double album. It was released on the 8th of January. So I've actually only heard this album twice, so this is more of a kind of first impressions piece than an actual review. But look, it's a bro country double album from Morgan Wallen that comes in at over an hour and a half. Can you blame me? Seriously? Anyway, Morgan Wallen is a frustrating presence in mainstream country. He clearly has great taste, and I'll give him that. The fact that he covers Jason Isbell's Cover Me Up for this album is evidence enough of that. And he often has the hooks as well, but he has approximately zero personality to back any of that up. In other words, he's a bro country star. A double album coming from this guy felt like a daunting prospect, and it's a total tonal clusterfuck. Because let's ask the question of what this album even is. Does it want to replicate the organic, neo-traditional country sound that Luke Combs is pushing right now? Does it want to replicate the overstuffed, clunky formula Florida Georgia Line? Is it going for a more atmospheric, spacey country sound like what Dierks Bentley was pushing a few years back? Or is it trying to do the awkward country hip-hop crossover thing complete with ugly drum machines that Sam Hunt does nowadays? Or maybe it's just going for the underweight, sneering obnoxiousness of a Luke Bryan or Thomas Rhett. Look, it tries everything, and the scariest thing about this might be that the first disc actually comes kinda close to being good. The hooks are decent, the production's more organic, and his Jason Isbell cover is genuinely pretty great. If this album was a sensible length, it could have been perfectly decent, if unmemorable. But unfortunately, the second disc is producer Joey Moore recycling a bunch of Florida Georgia Line leftovers, and the obnoxiousness gets turned up in the songwriting, and it borders on unlistenable at points. Something country, country-ass shit, and What You Think of Country Now are all flat garbage. Pair that with completely interchangeable bro-country songwriting, which only picks up some pathos on the more reminiscent tracks like Seven Summers, and you have a frustrating, bloated disaster that's a lot less humiliating than it should be because the first disc is actually pretty decent. It still is getting a very generous 5 out of 10 from me. There is way better country out there than this. Okay, we're in the end game. We are heading towards the end of this episode. Let's rattle quickly through 6 singles that were released this week that are of note. And let's start off with Justin Bieber's new one. It dropped on New Year's Day. It's called Anyone. And oh look, it's Justin Bieber trying to replicate the 10,000 hours formula, just without the support of Dan and Shay this time, for a song that's destined to get played on every wedding until the end of time. And oh my gosh, why does anyone care? Apart from, that's not actually exactly what this is. Bieber actually seems to be giving more of himself in what might be one of his most emotive vocal performances I've seen in a while, as he celebrates finding security in his relationship. It might be a disposable concept, but the hook does have some surprising pounding energy, and the trickling electronic patter is a decent foundation. While the song doesn't quite materialize and build in the way that I hoped it would, it sounds like it's trying to aim for the clouds, but the final hook doesn't build the exultant power that it really needs to match the painfully melodramatic lyrics. I also think the percussion is a little bit too over-mixed and jittery for the song to go down as easy as it clearly wants to. But look, it's still a tolerable song coming from Justin Bieber, and it shows that when he works with songwriters and producers that at least have some idea what they're doing, in this case John Bellion, decent songs, they can occasionally come of it, and this certainly is one of them. Next up, and this also dropped on New Year's Day, Foo Fighters with No Son of Mine. It's probably been years since I listened to Foo Fighters by choice, but I saw they had a new song out and, it wouldn't hurt to see what they were up to in 2021. Turns out I was not missing much, as this might be rock music at its most sludgy and sterile that I've heard lately. And yes, of course, I entirely blame Greg Kurstin. At least the hook does have some momentum to it, I'll give them that, even if it isn't catchy in the slightest, because this is rock music in the year 2021. And the songwriting isn't interesting either, with the group painting in painfully broad strokes, trying to highlight the hypocrisy that exists in this world, where the sons of world leaders don't practice what their fathers preach. But you probably wouldn't know that just by listening to this song because the writing is colourless. If this is supposed to be Foo Fighters making a triumphant political statement, yeah, this is kind of a failure. Moving on to a song that I have quite a bit more to say about, this is Olivia Rodrigo's new hit single that came out on the 8th of January. It's called Driver's License. So initially, I didn't recognize the name Olivia Rodrigo when I first came across this song, but it turns out she played the female lead in Disney's High School Musical, the series on Disney+, and even managed to score a charting hit on the Billboard Hot 100 with a song from that show that she wrote. So people are at least vaguely aware of who she is. Or at least they must be, because this single is doing serious numbers and it's gonna smash the Billboard Hot 100 in the midweek. Olivia Rodrigo is gonna be a star, maybe, whether we like it or not, but it helps that this song is actually really good. Sure, Rodrigo's songwriting is clearly playing to the heartbroken girl archetype in a very heavy-handed way, especially in how it describes the girl her ex is now with as everything she's insecure about, and oh my god, it's just so #relatable and all that. It does add a layer of transparent disposability to this song, or at least that's what I would say if the song felt at all melodramatic, which weirdly, it doesn't, because the songwriting is a lot more detailed than you might expect. I love how Rodrigo takes a moment in someone's life that should feel happy and rewarding, getting a driver's license for the first time. I haven't done that, but, certainly a lot of people who are listening to the song, they know that feeling. And then flips it on its head because she's more fixated on what it could have meant, perhaps what it should have meant to her if things hadn't gone awry in her relationship. I also love how self-aware she is to acknowledge that the relationship wasn't perfect when they were in it, but that didn't mean that it had to end. And most of all, I love the line, "Guess you didn't mean what you wrote in that song about me." As a songwriter, as all songwriters do, she's bound to think that writing a love song for someone is the ultimate unconditional display of affection, the most romantic thing you can do for someone. So her brain just isn't wired to deal with the betrayal as a result. It's details like this that give the song the edge that it really needs to work, and not come across as horrendously melodramatic. Unfortunately, I'm not entirely sure the song is that well produced. Not only is the melody on the verse just one note that gets plonked into oblivion, making for a song that's not all that melodically dynamic and interesting, but the thin, flimsy drum machines don't give Rodrigo's belting on the hook the foundation that they really need. I really want to hear a live version of this track with a real drum kit, because the painfully fake kick and hand clap do nothing to complement Rodrigo's surprisingly raw songwriting at all. Hopefully the production budget is tightened up in the future. Or maybe, I don't know, she could work with a Phineas or a Jack Antonoff. As it is, this is a very good, borderline great song. There have been many husky-voiced females that have come and tried to occupy the space that Lorde left in the mainstream. Your Dayas, your Alessia Caras, your Halseys, your Billie Eilishes. But I have no problem if the mainstream public was to add Olivia Rodrigo's name to that list, because this is a solid track. Okay, next up, Zara Larsson is teasing a new album. This single dropped on the 8th of January, and it's called Talk About Love, featuring Young Thug. I remember when Zara Larsson was primed to be the next big international smash hit pop star. Lush Life is still a banger to this day, and it looked like that was going to be her big international breakthrough, but it never materialized. And then the mainstream public picked Dua Lipa over her, which, to be honest, has gone pretty okay for us so far. But this is a new single for her upcoming album, her follow-up to So Good, and it's painfully mediocre at best. At least credit to the songwriters for writing a song where Larsson plays the one-night stand very straightforwardly and makes her intention to this guy very clear, but it's almost to an aggressive extent, basically saying, how dare this guy have emotions when I just want him to shut up and kiss me? And it makes a song that should feel exuberant or sexy feel kinda sour. Not helped by Young Thug opening his incredibly disposable verse with how he ain't got time to be lying like a rug. This is apparently where we're at when it comes to wordplay from Thugger. But the production just makes this even worse. Stripping out any of the colour of previous singles for one of the more stilted, stiff, and awkward fusions of pop and hip-hop that I've heard recently. It doesn't sound as underproduced and half-assembled as Ariana Grande songs often do, but it doesn't have the sweeping presence of a song like Ruin My Life, and it shows a record label determined to suck any shred of unique personality out of her music. What a shame. Hopefully this isn't the end of her career, but I don't hold up much hope for her going forward, not gonna lie. Okay, so now we're moving on to a song that I didn't even know dropped until I was deep into writing this episode. It's Selena Gomez's new one, and it dropped on the 14th of January. De Una Vez is the name of the track. I can't help but see this as a painfully cynical move for Selena Gomez. After all, reggaeton is popular as ever in the mainstream, so why not join in and write a radio hit entirely in Spanish? But the crazy thing is, this is actually better than pretty much every song on Rare, by some margin as well, and it's pretty much on production alone. The watery, ethereal vibe kind of rules, especially when the liquid guitar slips in, even if the percussion is a little grating, as it always is in reggaeton. The song is certainly abbreviated, with just the one verse about bouncing back after a breakup, and Selena Gomez has never been the most charismatic vocal presence in the world, and the song is basically just indistinct background music, and okay, maybe it's not that good, but at least it's something of an interesting direction for her, perhaps more intriguing than anything else, but whatever, I'll take what I can get. Finally, and thank goodness it's finally, because this has gone way, way, way too long, the latest from Alexa. It dropped on the 14th of January. It's called Never Let You Go. Yeah, and what felt like a pretty miserable week across the board in terms of stuff I watched and listened to, minus Pieces of a Woman, you should definitely watch that. I wanted to see if I could find a really great song to end this episode with, and I most certainly did. Now, I can see many people kind of dismissing this song as a pretty, but not particularly memorable K-pop ballad. But then you pay attention to the songwriting and you realize there's a lot more going on than meets the eye. Alexa might not have a writing credit on this track, but she sings it and sells it as if she did. She talks about an ex that she didn't appreciate in the way she should have done, and how if they ever did meet again, she would make an effort to right those wrongs and love them the way that they deserve to be loved. But it's all a bit of a dumb fantasy, and she knows she lost her chance with that person a long time ago. But that's not going to stop her rehearsing the conversations in her head that they might have had if they were to meet in passing. It's a very introverted, reminiscent breakup song where Alexa is willing to take responsibility for not giving enough of her, but has learned from the experience, grown as a person, and is ready to move forward with the newfound knowledge, even as the thought of what could have been with this person continues to play on her mind. If anything, it plays out like a willowier and more abstract version of Taylor Swift's Back to December, just as a K-pop track. It also sounds pretty breathtaking too. Twinkling pianos, shimmering guitars both acoustic and electric, strings and gentle rustling percussion. It just creates an amazing gleaming atmosphere. Alexa's singing is also fantastic, emotional but strong. It just kind of rules across the board. I'm so happy I have K-pop like this on my radar, and if Alexa wants to drop a project this year, I will certainly be covering it. Album or EP, whatever. This is great stuff. So that took longer than expected. Hopefully throughout the year I'll be able to build more of a schedule and understand the best way to, do things better. So expect a bit more going forward. And also hopefully next week will be better than this. Also watch Pieces of a Woman, it's amazing. Hopefully there's better on the horizon, but I'll see you next time.